Good evening. All right, we're finally going to get started. Thank you so much for your patience. We really appreciate you guys just being willing to be flexible and move around. We're so excited to have a full house tonight, and we can't wait just to hear from Dr. Zacharias. So we're going to get started. So my name is Josh Temple.
And my name is Mira Valiath, and we're both junior chemical engineers here at Hopkins. We'd like to quickly point out the surveys that are located in your program. If everyone could take a few minutes to fill those out, we will be collecting them at the end of the evening. Also, if you do fill out the survey, you will be entered to win a free iPad. So there's incentive for that. Lastly, we would just like to ask everyone to either turn their cell phones off or put them on airplane mode so they don't interfere with the wireless microphones.
All right, and with that, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's forum, The Problem of Suffering and the Goodness of God. Now, here at Hopkins, we like to think of ourselves as fairly accustomed to suffering. Anyone who's been on sea level at 2 a.m. knows what I'm talking about. But when you're on sea level at 2 a.m. poring over a problem set, it's easy to forget that most of us came to Hopkins with some sort of bigger goal of making the world a better place than it is today.
And these days we find that suffering is all around us, whether it's in the news coverage of the recent typhoon in the Philippines, human trafficking in Baltimore, loss of a loved one. Surrounded by all this suffering in our world, the question arises, if there's a God who cares, why does suffering exist? Is this question that several Hopkins Christian ministries decided to partner together, in light of this question, several Hopkins Christian ministries decided to partner together to invite Dr. Ravi Zacharias to speak on this topic. Before Dr. Zacharias comes to the stage, we'd like to invite Kathy Schnur, the chaplain of the Hopkins Interfaith Center, to make a few opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is the first time I've had to wear glasses in public to read. The indignities of the flesh visit us all. Good evening and welcome. My name is Kathy Schnur, and I serve as the Johns Hopkins University chaplain. I'm so pleased that you are here tonight for what I'm sure will be an engaging and thought-provoking program. I want to thank all of the students, advisors, staff, and friends who have made this evening possible. I know that this is a particularly intense time of the semester, and I want you to know that the work and care you have put into making this program a success is greatly appreciated. As an institution dedicated to discovery and exploration, we commit our intellect, energy, and rigor to the examination of the big questions that we all engage. What is the source of life? How do we bring about world peace? What is the truth about our past? How do we learn? How can we bring about healing? And many others. The list is long. It is no surprise that these are some of the essential questions for our religious and spiritual traditions, practices, and communities, and indeed for our hearts and souls. We must bring the same energy, intellect, and rigor to these questions as we encounter and engage them in and across our families of faith. The students here who have spent time involved in religious and spiritual life groups, programs, and projects, or who have found our Interfaith Center to be a place for reflection, learning, and relaxation, are accustomed to hearing me talk about deep listening, tuning our ears and our minds to hear what someone is telling us about who they are, carefully sharing ourselves and asking questions with respect and thoughtfulness, with an attention to learning. We work diligently to ensure that we are not clouding our hearing with thoughts about what we think we may already know or retorts we may have prepared in advance. Rather, we are listening with intent to develop deeper understanding of the other. And in so doing, we often learn about ourselves the most. I invite all of you tonight to join us in this most important spiritual practice.
Thank you so much, Kathy. With that, we would like to introduce to you our speaker for the evening, Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
Dr. Zacharias is a senior research fellow at Oxford University with 40 years of speaking experience. He has spoken for distinguished audiences all over the world, notably Harvard, Princeton, the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the United Nations. He has authored or edited over 20 books, several of which have been translated into other languages. He is founder and president of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, an organization dedicated to reaching and challenging society with the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Please join us in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be with you tonight, and I hope I do not add to the problem of pain as I speak on this particular subject. The good news is that after I finish speaking on it as best as I can within the time that we have on hand, I'm going to be joined by two of my colleagues, Dr. Vince Vitale, who is a lecturer at Wycliffe Hall and Oxford University. He did his studies at Princeton and his doctoral work at Oxford. You'll hear more from him about him later. And Dr. Nabil Qureshi, who is actually also on our team. He is a medical doctor, but has also acquired a couple of postgraduate degrees in theological training and text of scripture and so on. They will tell you more about them as they come onto the platform, but I think it's wonderful for me to have them, at least for a couple of reasons. Number one, anything that I say that makes sense, I'll be glad to answer your questions about those. If it doesn't make sense, they will be answering the questions on those. For a couple of reasons. Vince Vitale, when he was at Princeton, then at Oxford, was not only a student of philosophy, but also was a light welterweight boxing competitor there, did extremely well. And anyone who has been in the business of inflicting pain ought to be able to justify it as to why that was done. And Nabil Qureshi, as a medical doctor, would have been on the other side of the ring, catering to the needs of the one that was felled. So he'll give you justifiable reasons for why he alleviates pain. Looking at two of them, I'm really glad they're here. And in all seriousness, I think you will find our time of interaction to be very, very meaningful. We come off various itineraries from different parts of the world and different kinds of audiences. And everyone knows that this is possibly the most daunting question that challenges any theistic framework, but also any naturalistic framework, because both worldviews have to explain, in the former case, how the doctrine that they hold to in terms of the existence of an all-powerful and an all-loving God can allow the kind of evil and suffering that we experience in the world. But from the counter perspective, those who deny the existence of God on the basis of such suffering then have to find a way to explain moral reasoning. Both of them have tried it. I'm not sure that I have found the answer from the counter perspective very convincing. People like Daniel Dennett and Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris. Sam Harris particularly has written most recently on the subject, and Daniel Dennett goes to great lengths in his interviews to point out what he will call the evidential problem with the existence of God, namely the problem of evil, the problem of pain, and the problem of suffering. So with that as a backdrop, hopefully we will touch some of these authors as we go along, and certainly in the question and answer time, I hope we will do our best to interact with you. Let me just say that as a speaker and one who talks on themes such as these, although it's been a long time since this particular subject was assigned to me, certainly it comes from the floor, no matter what the subject is in the defense of theism, that we're fully aware of how tough these questions are. Anyone who minimizes it obviously doesn't understand the question. And sometimes I get the feeling when those who attack theism or the Christian faith in particular seem to think that we're sort of foolish in ignoring this problem. We actually don't ignore it. Daniel Dennett, referring to Alvin Plantinga and his debate with the great philosopher Plantinga, said, well, his argument was very logical, but his belief is preposterous. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? So making a value judgment after actually denying that values actually exist. Quite pronounced, quite dramatic. But both sides feel the struggle, and every worldview wrestles with this. In fact, it has been rightly said that virtue in distress and vice in triumph often makes atheists of mankind. Virtue in distress and vice in triumph often makes atheists of mankind. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century Scottish political activist, said this, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. And the reason Fletcher said that was that while reason and logic and argument may come to you from the front door of rationality, music and the arts often come through the back door of the imagination. And that's why sometimes my work at Cambridge University was in really the Romantic poets. And when I see how poetry and music and the arts so often raise the question in very thorny ways, they sometimes even hint at the answer that oftentimes those who are given to pure reasoning do not even move in that direction. The famed music group Moody Blues said this, "Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door?" That is the musician raising it. And any time you see the problem raised, you begin to see how easy it is to give a long list of tragedies and atrocities as if we're in need of justifying that evil and suffering really exist. What I want to do is try to illustrate for you this evening that not only do we feel it, not only do we wrestle with it, not only do we argue our way through it and debate it in our own minds, but I've come to the conclusion that the problem of evil is better stated as a mystery rather than a problem. Why do I say that? I believe a problem is very easy to describe. I think it was Gabriel Marcel who said that a mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. So in a mystery, when it encroaches upon itself and you are part of the very question being raised, that becomes harder to answer, but a problem is easier to deal with. As someone said, getting to Mars is a problem, falling in love is a mystery. So let me repeat what Marcel says. A mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. You and I are not outside of this question. We are in the question itself. I remember a medical doctor in the Middle East once describing to me how shocked he was to go through the experience of a heart attack, and he is a pain management specialist. He said, "Ravi, I realized when I was in the throes of that heart attack how difficult it was to describe it." He said, when a person says, "My arm is hurting, my leg is hurting, my head is hurting," it is as if whatever you are describing is experiencing pain is an appendage and something attached to the essential you. He said, when I was going through the heart attack, the only way to describe it was that I was in the pain. I was in the pain. The very organ that was intended to generate life instead was generating pain for me. And the problem of evil, I believe, is pretty much the same. Let's look at it first, the reality of it. David Hume, the skeptic, put it this way: were a stranger to suddenly drop into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with the ultimate purpose of love. Interesting that the skeptic raises the question with the varieties of pain and suffering and then brings it to a closing statement on trying to square it with the ultimate purpose of love. Another existentialist put it this way: it is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God. It is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos. That there is a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe which will always defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose, look at the world, and that settles it for me. Now notice the first one in raising the question interjects the possibility, the impossibility of squaring it with the purpose of love. The existentialist says, how can there really be any purpose in life if all that we see around us in this pitiless, unending struggle for existence? So it is not science that was knocking him off any belief. It was just the fact that there was such despair and meaninglessness in the world that he saw around him. But second is the universality of the problem. Gautama Buddha, in moving away from being born a Hindu and in search of answers, looking at suffering and looking at old age, looking at death, looking at these sights as he was raised in a palace, left the palatial precincts and the comfort of it, ironically, on the very night that his first child, his son, was born. He left the palace, went away in search of answers to the problem of suffering. And by the way, the word he uses is the word dukkha, which is much more than the idea of pain or discomfort. Dukkha can best be described as an anguish that is so overwhelming to you, almost in the essential nature of who you are. So it's not mere philosophy. It's a struggle within that soulishness that is you, which is what Buddha was talking about. So he gave up his upbringing in Hinduism, renounced some of the teachings of the Vedas and the whole idea of the caste system, and he went in search of enlightenment and then came up with his eightfold path and the Four Noble Truths, the first one of which was all life is suffering. And his conclusion was, if you cease to desire, if you stop wanting, you will eliminate any suffering whatsoever. So Buddha went along that path, which tells you there's a universality to it. Now, I was raised in India. My ancestors were Orthodox Hindu priests from the deep south. And I find it very fascinating that India, which is so intensely religious, is also a country that has lived with a lot of suffering and a lot of deprivation. The songs that they sing, the music that's so often present in their movies will oftentimes talk of the pain and suffering. And yet, with that pain and suffering is that intense sense of religiosity. And yet, if you move through Europe and the West and come into the United States and so on, with all of the prosperity and all of the comforts, we are gradually becoming more atheistic all the time. Fascinating difference where cultures in the midst of pain have sought answers for the spirit. Those in the midst of greater comforts are walking away from belief in God. Is it because we're more intelligent than them? Better qualified, more degrees, understand reality better than the great philosophers that have come from the East and continue to look at this as a struggle for the soul? So first is the reality, second is the universality, third is the complexity of the problem. You've got the metaphysical aspect of it. What is the source of it, which is what we wrestle with most here. Then there's the physical aspect of it, natural disasters. There's the moral aspect of it. How can an all-powerful and an all-loving God allow this? So metaphysically, physically, and morally, we struggle to find answers. But here it is. As we look at this, I want you to understand right from the beginning what has to be a framework from which we answer this question. However you answer it, there has to be a framework. And the framework is this. This is just one question that tries to define what ultimate reality is all about. But the question hinges on to many others. The moment you move in the direction of coming to a conclusion on this, for example, the staunch atheist who says there is no way to see the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God, therefore this world is really godless, we have to find meaning and purpose in this very world. There's no way to sustain the existence of God. The question then comes for that person, how is this then inextricably not joined to the question of meaning? It ties in to the question of purpose and meaning. I'll tell you why. In saying that we experience suffering and evil, we are looking for a purpose to explain it. But then we conclude sometimes, the skeptic does, that there is no purpose to life itself. It actually creates a bigger conundrum when there is no ultimate purpose, why we need to find tiny little purposes after all, other than the justification of being purely pragmatic. C.S. Lewis put it in these words: when a ship goes on to the high seas, it has to answer three questions. Number one, how to keep that ship from sinking. He said that's personal ethics. Number two, how to keep from bumping into other ships. That is social ethics. He said, but the most important question is, why is the ship out there in the first place? That is essential ethics. Do you realize that for the skeptic, the most important question is unanswered? They can come up with sort of social ethics, sort of a construct we can create, or personal ethics, why it is not good for me to cheat you or lie to you if the species is to survive. But they've still not been able to give us what the purpose of life is all about. We're just here. Time plus matter plus chance. And so as I deal with it, I want to take on three challenges that come to the Christian theist or to the theist in general, and then give you what I consider the Judeo-Christian answer, at least in a series of steps. Number one, it is this. The evidential challenge basically says that I cannot believe in God because of the presence of evil. There is too much evil, therefore there cannot be an ultimate, all-powerful being. I recall in my earlier days when I was starting out speaking at the University of Nottingham. It was in the middle of my whole series of lectures, and I was talking once on the search for meaning. And a fellow stood up right at the back and he said, just shouted out at me, he said, there's too much of evil, too much of evil. There simply cannot be a God. So I said, can I interact with you for a moment? So he remained standing. I said, sir, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He says, yeah. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He paused and struggled with that a bit, sort of looking around and thinking. I said, let me help you here. I said, when Bertrand Russell was debating the philosopher Frederick Copleston, at one point Copleston looked at Russell and said to him, do you believe in good and bad? Do you believe there's such a thing as good and such a thing as bad? He said, yeah. He said, how do you differentiate between it? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute. You differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? Russell said, yes. He said, how do you differentiate between good and bad? This great philosopher, mathematician gave this answer. On the basis of feeling. What else? Now, Copleston was a kind man. Somebody ought to have turned to Bertrand Russell and say, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors. In other cultures they eat them. Both on the basis of feeling. Do you have a personal preference? On the basis of feeling? Really? On the basis of feeling? So he said, all right, I'll grant you there's such a thing as a moral law. So I said, when you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you're saying there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, all right, I'll grant you that. I said, but if you grant me a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, because that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? He stood there, eyeballed me and said, what then am I asking you? I said, if you don't know, how am I supposed to help you what it is you're asking me? Now, let me be fair here. Somebody might pause and say, Ravi, I'll grant you that there is evil and good. I might even stretch it a little bit and say, yeah, there are such things as moral laws. People like Dennett and Harris will sort of not go for the absolute, but they would certainly go for moral reasoning and moral thinking as something as having an ontic referent to which, by which we can make our judgments. But why do we have to have a moral lawgiver? And my answer to that is this. All questions about evil are either raised by a person or about a person. All questions on evil is either raised by a person or about a person, which means the questioner is making an incredible assumption that human beings have essential value, and that's what makes their question justifiable. That as a questioner, my question is valuable because I'm a person of value and have the right to raise it. Or the one I'm talking about in whose defense I have come, I am raising this because that person has essential value. Why do we argue for justice? Why do we come to the right, to the defense of the innocent? Because deep within us we believe that the person of value and worth ought not to be sacrificed at a whim. The essential value of human life is assumed in raising the question. And so the moral lawgiver has to be within the paradigm. If there is no moral lawgiver, I don't see how there is a moral law. If there is no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, evil ultimately self-destructs. And the irony of it is, this is where some atheistic philosophers are being forced to get off. People like Dawkins and all, whom I might quote. But at the same time, the tension remains and the struggle remains. Let me position this for you with two illustrations. Vince Vitale and I are co-authoring a book, incidentally, on the problem of suffering. We're suffering through it right now, trying to work through it. And I was watching a BBC production on polar bears. Yeah, I do those things. I learned more from that than a lot of other stuff that goes on being idiotized in front of a box. So I may as well watch that. And so I was watching the BBC production on polar bears, and this polar bear wakes from its hibernation sleep, and its two young cubs are waiting to be fed, so it marches off. It's looking for food. And the ice is rather thin there, and he's making his way, but he gets to a pack of walruses, and he's eyeing for the youngest and the most baby walrus out there, and he spots one. But the bigger ones are aware that the predator is near, and so they're closing in a bit of a circle. Finally, with bounding strides, he leaps into their midst, desperately trying to get this baby walrus. The bigger ones are butting away at this polar bear, and the polar bear ultimately unable to penetrate these defenses and gets bloodied in the process. The last scene is the polar bear turning and walking around back and digging its own grave. It does not now have the strength to make it all the way back to the cave. And you know, you look at it and your heart goes out. You're feeling sorry to see that happen. And the BBC commentator ends with this comment. He said, you know what? If there weren't any such thing as global warming, the polar bear would not have taken so long to get to its prey. And that's why we are responsible for the death of that polar bear. Wow. You almost feel like putting up your hand, coming forward, getting on your knees and say, dear polar bear, please forgive me for what I have just done to you. Now here's what I want to say to you. Suppose he is right. Suppose he is right. Why didn't he blame the polar bear for oversleeping? If it had got up a couple of days earlier, maybe it would have had more strength and got some other kind of prey. Why didn't he look to the beastly world to find some kind of incrimination there? He goes to us as human beings. You see, the inescapability of moral reasoning that comes around into the human heart, where you and I have to ask ourselves the question, if that is true, what responsibility must I bear for something like this? And I then have to take my personal responsibility in a world such as this. Second question, moving completely away to a different scene. My whole life has been surrounded by experiences that I never dreamed I would ever have. I don't know how many of you are even aware of my own journey spiritually. I was totally non-theistic, if not atheistic, growing up in this home, and I had no time for any of the religions in which I was raised. None. And at the age of 17, attempted to take my own life. And on that bed, when a Bible was brought to me, it's a long story, how my heart was changed, my life was turned. And subsequent to that, I never dreamed of all the experiences through which I was going to have to go in life to both enrich and to both plant questions within my mind in my pursuit of truth. I made my commitment to Christ at the age of 17. I speak to you now 50 years later. Is the most dramatic moment and the most incredible transformation that came about. And my father were here, he would tell you, of all my children, I never ever dreamed that this, my boy, would make anything out of his own life. And so traveling around, I sometimes watched things happen. When I was in my 20s, I was in Vietnam, also in Cambodia. I saw the horrors of war. I saw dreadful mangling of bodies taking place on the side of the highway. And I thought to myself, it's incredible, absolutely incredible what I'm witnessing. And in the 1980s, during the Cold War, I was in Auschwitz. If none of you has ever been to a death camp, it would be the most sobering trip of a lifetime to go and see one. Not a concentration camp, a death camp. I'd been to concentration camp, Birkenau, Buchenwald, Dachau, and all of those. I'd never been to a death camp, but I was speaking at the universities in Poland and was taken one day to see it. When I walked through the rooms and saw what humanity had done to its fellow human being, and at that time the most educated nation in the world, inflicted by the rhetoric and the power of one man who seemed to think there was a super race and a better race that could eliminate all the weak ones in the world and make this a better world for whoever survived, the strong ones. In one room there was 14,000 pounds of women's hair stashed behind glass. Women who were scalped before they were taken into the gas rooms, to the rooms where the poison gas was just released through those jets, and as they were stacked up like animals, collapsing onto their knees, being obliterated in Auschwitz alone at the rate of 12,000 every day. One room with children upon whom Mengele performed his experiments, standing there, castrated little boys like that. If you looked into their eyes, you were just staring at absolute emptiness. And Mengele was doing his scientific experiments on them. As the rock musician would say, knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, was in the hands of fools. So he was doing it. And then I walked over to the gas ovens there, and I saw a sign by Adolf Hitler. I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. Now here's the conundrum. Here's the difficulty. People like Dennett and Harris and all can pontificate on these ideas, how we can arrive at values. This is the whole search of Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, that we have to solve this issue of value. Dennett in an interview keeps on repeating this thing. And he says, so long as we don't believe in absolutes. Well, that itself is an absolute statement. But apart from that, he comes through with this incredible comment at one point. He said, if within a culture you have certain values that you hold to, don't impose them on another culture. Isn't that an absolute? Isn't that an absolute?
Absolutely.
And so listen, here's what J.L. Mackie, the Australian atheist, says. Here's what he says. We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. The kind of configuration we need, says this atheist, to explain values and objectively, intrinsically prescriptive features is most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. And hence the atheist also, Michael Ruse, talking about the kind of answers that Harris and all give, he says illusionary answers. He said there is no way to get away from the fact that we struggle to explain moral reasoning. Think, for example, of what Kai Nielsen, the Canadian atheist, says. We have not been able to show that reason alone requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this really depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. It's an atheist. So where do we get off? We get off with Richard Dawkins. Here's what he says. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. About 3-4 months ago, the Australian cricket team was in England, and they were playing these test matches, which last 5 days. People can never figure it out, how a match can last 5 days, but they do. If you love cricket, it's a foretaste of heaven. I enjoyed playing cricket. But there was an English cricketer by the name of Stuart Broad. He was at the crease batting, and he was out. The ball hit the bat, and he was caught behind by the catcher. He knew it, everybody knew it, but the umpire didn't see it. Because the umpire gave him not out. Now you have an appeal, but they had run out of their appeals, and the Australian cricket team could not appeal of that. And Broad, because of the few extra runs that he made afterwards, ended up being the difference between winning and losing. You should have seen the outrage of Richard Dawkins. He tweeted, "I'm ashamed of being an Englishman here," he said. "This is not cricket." He should have walked. Stuart Broad is a cheat. And he wasn't prepared for the huge deluge of tweets that came. Richard, it's okay. He's dancing to his DNA. Fascinating. You can dance to your DNA, but not when the other person is dancing to his, and you are the victim. I say to you what G.K. Chesterton said, all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. An infinite skeptic. So when you talk about the evidential problem, you have to end up where Dawkins says, there's no such thing really as evil. I asked a student at Oxford University after I gave a talk there some years ago, and he said, I don't believe in absolutes. And he was surrounded by a lot of students with him, and I said, can I ask you a question? If I take a 1-year-old baby on this platform and take a sharp butcher knife and I carved up that baby and chopped that baby up into pieces for my pure pleasure, do you think I would have done anything morally wrong? He paused, drew some design with his toe on the carpet, and then he looks at me and said, Mrs. Zacharias, I wouldn't like what you did, but I couldn't honestly say that what you did was morally wrong. And the same sound by the students standing there. Can you live existentially with that philosophy that there is no such thing as moral evil? Second attack, we can find biological reasons, sociological reasons by which we can arrive at this. I bring two counter-responses to that. Number one, if it's only physical, if it's only biological, how do we ever explain supererogatory acts as acts of nobility? How do we ever explain supererogatory acts? What is a supererogatory act? Some years ago, Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence told about Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey on that Amtrak train that went down in the South into the swirling waters, in which one compartment after another fell into those waters and several people were killed. My good friend R.C. Sproul was actually on that train. His was the last compartment there that literally was dangling at the end. It did not fall into the swirling waters. He told us about that story. But Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey had a wheelchair-ridden little girl, 11 years old. And as they saw her struggling and wanted to know how they could make her escape at the same time, young Andrea with cerebral palsy, tied up in this wheelchair, neither Gary nor Mary Jean would leave by leaving their girl in that situation. They tried to hoist up that wheelchair, and as the rescuers were swimming in the swirling waters there, trying to get closer and closer, they held her as long as they could, and with one last heave, thrust her into the arms of the rescuers, while both of them lost their lives in the process. That's a supererogatory act against the natural instinct, because the fact of the matter is that little girl could not support herself. The weaker was protected by the stronger whose life was sacrificed. You see the same thing in Molokai, in Hawaii, where I visited, and saw what Father Joseph Damien did in the rescue of people with leprosy. It's a beautiful island, but plagued by leprosy for many, many years, and Damien came from Belgium, took care of them. When Damien himself contracted leprosy and died, the Belgian government asked for his body to be flown back, and the people in Molokai said, please don't take his body away. We want him to be buried here. He loved us. He took care of us. And the stories are amazing of what Damien did for them. And finally the Belgian government said, he's one of our heroes. We want him back here. So then they wrote and said, would you do us a favor? Can we cut off his right arm and keep the hand that touched us, that embraced us? And today in Molokai, Damien's right arm is buried as a memorial to the love and the grace that he showed to people who were deemed untouchable. A supererogatory act. But then there comes a second question. If bioscience and all leads us into ethics, the kind that Dennett and all talk about, here's my question for you. I've been to the Middle East many times. I've been on peace missions with religious leadership to talk to both sides of it. Sometimes I would hear answers and just crush my spirit and wondered if there was any hope. And when one of those, I shall leave the man unnamed, he was one of the leading part of a violent group out there, founded one of those terrorist groups. And I asked him a question. I can't really tell you what question I asked because it was a private conversation. But the answer that he gave is chilling, absolutely chilling. And I said to him, I can't leave here without responding to you in some way. I'm your guest, but I want to talk to you about this. So here's what I want to say. Listen to me very carefully. In all of our efforts to find some kind of naturalistic explanation for why we must be good, noble, kind, and I'm all for it. And let me put a caveat in here. I'm not for a moment saying that an atheist or a non-theist or an agnostic cannot be a good person. No, no, no. That's not what I'm saying. I've met many good, decent people who don't believe in God. So I'm not accusing the person themselves of not possessing that virtue. I am just saying, how does one bring about a rationally compelling way to defend it? And when people of a different culture arrive at a totally different conclusion culturally and geopolitically, what is the basis of telling them they have no right to come to their conclusion? You see, when Jesus was asked about the laws that were supreme, Moses had given 613 laws. David reduced them to 15. Isaiah brought them down to 11. And then we see going on down that they're brought down further to 6. And then Micah comes up with 3, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? I find it fascinating he didn't answer with 1. He could have done it. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these 2 laws hang all of the prophets and all of the other laws. You see, because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. That I am obligated to love my neighbor even with their disagreements of my worldview. I have no right to violate the sacredness of your life, your marriage, your property, and that which you treasure. Neither have you the right to violate the sacredness of my life and my home, my marriage, and my property. I think Jesus is spot on here. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 hang all of the laws and the prophets. And so when we talk about somehow neurologically or biochemically coming out, we are ignoring a vast horde of humanity. I was sitting with 2 young guys from a completely different worldview in Jerusalem. And I have to tell you, we get into these places and they've been very good to me, even if they get rather loud. We'll talk. I've lectured at many, many campuses of a different worldview. And this guy looked at me and he said, let me tell you something. We will first take care of Saturday, then we will take care of Sunday. And I knew exactly what he was saying. That was his law. That was his commitment. And do I come to him and say, you know, biochemically, I don't think you're responding with any sense of nobility here? May have been my last statement. And I say to you, these counter perspectives are not answering the question. So I close with that and move quickly to my answers here. Viktor Frankl, who was in Auschwitz, said this: if we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka and Majdanek were ultimately not prepared in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Frankl. And I bring to you that that is where one ultimately gets off, when you lose the essential value of human life and the transcendent moral order. Bertrand Russell paid the Christian worldview the ultimate compliment without even thinking about it. His quotation stands outside Mahatma Gandhi's home. And by the way, Gandhi traveled with the New Testament in his pocket all of his life, quoted from the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly. And Gandhi, as he fought for the freedom of his own people, Bertrand Russell says this incredibly, that's in a banner outside Gandhiji's home. Here's what it says: it is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded, except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people. Here's an atheist complimenting the success of a pantheist because of the moral values of a theist. Fascinating. So, where do we go from the Christian point of view? I give you 6 thoughts, 1 or 2 I'll elaborate on, some I'll keep brief. Number 1, God is the author of life. God is the author of life. We can spend all of our time on the method used and the manner used and the time and all of that. My point to you right now is, however you move directionally, and I've known Christians on many sides of this. Our colleague at Oxford, John Lennox, has written a powerful book. Here's a man with a triple doctorate in science who's written the book called 7 Days That Divide the World. What I say to you is, the source of my value is given to me by God. I have that intrinsic value for life. You know, as I talk to you, I've become a grandfather 3 times in the last couple of years. Our youngest one's about 2 months old. And I was talking to Vince as we were driving in here. My daughter is terribly concerned because of a serial respiratory viral infection that she has contracted in the last 48 hours. And my daughter spent the last 2 nights, the last night in the hospital and today all day with the doctor. And here's my daughter, wee little thing herself, she and her husband, with this little baby that came home at 5 pounds and 10 ounces. Tiny little one. And all of a sudden, here now at the 2-month age, gets this viral infection probably and beginning to lose weight, which she can hardly afford to lose. And I watch the love of a mother and hear the voice on the phone of how dearly she cares for this little one. Dad, please pray for me. Please pray with me. This is very hard for me to watch my little one going through this. Every life has intrinsic value and worth. And it behooves us to reach out to the weakest and the littlest ones among us. There is that mystery of life. There is an author. If there is an author, there is a script and there is a story. That's the second thing I give to you, that there is a storyline. And once you understand the storyline, it explains the contingencies. I remember when I was first unaware of the story of the Phantom of the Opera. And I'd be driving around and listening to that music, and I'd say, why on earth is this guy screaming? You know, it's not music. You know, go, what music is this? Yeah, I know operas, you can grovel and all of that, I know that, but this was really not musical. You watch the play, and it's some of the most magnificent music that Andrew Lloyd Webber has put together. Both the screams and the beautiful tones are understandable in the light of the story. Once you get the script, once you understand the story, you begin to understand what it is that God brings together here. Now I want you to follow me. Time's running out, so I have to give this to you as briefly as I can. Where there is freedom, there is a possibility of love. Where there is love, there's a possibility of pain. Where there is pain, there's a possibility of a Savior. Where there is a Savior, there's a possibility of redemption. Where there is redemption, there is a possibility of restoration. Freedom makes love possible. Love makes pain possible. Pain makes the Savior possible. And the Savior brings redemption, and the redemption brings restoration. I have seen this again and again and again demonstrated in life. My colleague Matt, who travels with me, will tell you. Just a few months ago, May of this year, I was in Manila in the Philippines, and unknown to me, a very prominent person in the country stood up at the end of my talk and walked up to the microphone, standing about 6'3" or so, handsome-looking guy, and his tears running down his face. He said, "You're talking about meaning, purpose." He said, "I don't have it." He said, "I'm living with three things: pain, shame, and guilt." Pain, shame, and guilt. How can you help me? I didn't even know he was an actor, but I said to him, "You know, you're a made-for-the-movies kind of guy." And I said, "You talk about meaninglessness." When we were driving back that night, I saw his face all over the billboards everywhere. He told me his story. He was a playboy in private, living a totally debauched life, and a drug addict to the core. Well-known film actor. If I named him, anybody here who comes from the Philippines will know exactly whom I'm talking about. I probably don't even name him. He was living this duplicitous, horrid life, videoed himself in all of his exploits. Somebody broke into his apartment, took all of those videos, put it on YouTube. He was branded the most hated man in the Philippines. So he comes to me, opens up, bows his head, and gives his life to Christ. He says, "I have a request to ask you." He said, "Ravi, please, can I travel with you as much as possible over the next several months? I just want to learn." So he's been covering all of the globe with us. Came to Indonesia, came to Singapore, came to Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and Malaysia, India, so on. A week ago, he writes to me. I could read his letter to you. I wept when I read it, and I sent it to my colleagues in the team. He said, "I want to tell you, when I came back to the Philippines, I wasn't expecting to see the terrible devastation." He said, "I've taken my valuables and I have auctioned them off. I'm raising money, and we've raised quite a bit. I'm personally going to fly out to help the suffering and the wounded and try to bring some meaning and help and hope into their lives." A few months ago, he was plundering people. Now, he writes a letter, and I say to myself, my goodness, what a story, what a script. The story is this. What is it? Number 3, that life is sacred. Life is sacred. And may I say this to you, the problem in the Christian life and the gospel is not that we are not moral. The problem really is that we are dead. We are dead to God. And Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came to make dead people live. The grace of Christ brings you to worship. Now, I want to point out 2 things, and my next few comments will be very brief. It's this. When we talk of the purpose of life as worship and intrinsically sacred, follow me now, please. The greatest question the big 3 raised of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle was this. How do we find unity in diversity? How do we find unity in diversity? That's why we created universities, to find unity in diversity. That's the whole meaning. That's the whole meaning. And by the way, I commend you for your motto. Do you know what precedes what your motto is? If you abide in my word, you are my disciples. Then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Truth's not standing again with his feet in midair. And so the whole idea of the sacred and the big three looking for unity and diversity, where do you find it? That's why we came up with the word quintessence, because they gave us four: earth, air, water, fire. Somebody said, that's not unity. We need a fifth essence that unites these four essences. That's the fifth essence. America was founded e pluribus unum, to find unity and diversity. Boy, it doesn't look like it very much right now. But here it is. How do we find unity in diversity? That question haunts all of us. Archbishop William Temple said, worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's a quickening of conscience by his holiness, nourishment of mind by his truth, purifying of imagination by his beauty, opening of the heart to his love, and submission of will to his purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Quickening of conscience by his holiness, mind by his truth, imagination by beauty, heart to his love, will to his purpose. You will never find unity and diversity on the outside until we have found unity and diversity on the inside. You see, the reason we honor our vows is the same reason we pay our taxes. You do not violate the sacred trust God has given to you and to me. Just think of what a different world we would be living in if you and I treated with sacred respect the right of another person. That's the greatest gift God has given to you and me. And think of all the battles we have in violating each other's sacred rights. And ultimately we stand before God with the right that he gave to us to come to him, to worship him, and to serve him. If worship is at the core, then one of the fingers in the fist of worship is love. Let me quote Jean-Paul Sartre, C.S. Lewis, move to my final thought here. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, the man who wants to be loved does not desire the enslavement of the beloved. He is not bent on becoming the object of passion which flows forth mechanically. He does not want to possess an automaton, and if we want to humiliate him, we need try to only persuade him that the beloved's passion is the result of a psychological determinism. This is Sartre. The lover will then feel that both his love and his being are cheapened. If the beloved is transformed into an automaton, the lover finds himself alone. In other words, love has to have the freedom of the will. Let me read this for you from C.S. Lewis. It's a powerful quote. C.S. Lewis says this: to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to nobody, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbearable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Fyodor Dostoevsky said, when he was asked to define hell, he said, I can only think of one statement: the inability to love. And so that leads me to the Christian answer: in the cross of Christ. You know, I find it amazing that those two pieces of timber you see all over the world, and as the suffering ensued, and he says, for this very purpose did I come into the world. I say to you that the answer given in the cross is, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, and the transformation of the heart. I have just one illustration, one application to make. If you go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I was some months ago, and visiting a prison, the Angola prison, 5,300 prisoners there, 85% of them on life without parole, 45 on death row. It was called the bloodiest prison in America. When a prisoner was checked in, he was given a knife to protect himself. Blood on the carpets, blood on the walls, ceilings, hardcore criminals. I spoke to them 2 or 3 times. The last meeting, 700 live and piped into every cell. The chaplain comes in and he says, I'll take charge of this prison, not the chaplain, the warden. He said, let me do it my way. He puts a Bible in every cell. And he holds Bible studies and brings them out when they can get there. Some of them are now cooking the meals. Some of them are hosting us. I spoke, and the entire band and the worship leaders were hardcore criminals who are not going to get out of there. And as I watched them and watched so many of them and their lives dramatically transformed, the amazing thing to me was to wonder what really brought them in there. 85% of them are not going to see the light of day outside that prison. It has become the safest prison, maximum security prison in the country. Scripture verses all over the walls. And I looked at one man and I said to him, can I ask you a question? I said, sir, are you one of those on life without parole? He said, yes. I said, you're very young. He said, yes, sir. I said, how do you feel about that? I said, I really want to hear. I hope it's not an offensive question to you. He called me by my name. He said, you know, Ravi, because I'd just spoken to them, if you knew the man I was and the chains that were binding me inside, if it took prison for me to come to find true freedom, then I'm just happy to be here. I have found life in here in my soul that I never had out there. If you want to pray, pray for my parents who think they're free, but they're actually in bondage. What do you say to that? What do you say to that? Which leads me to my final conclusion. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 questions, 1 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we knock at the door? You know how the song ends? I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I'm looking for someone to change my life. That is the Christian answer. The transformation of the heart and the change that God brings to you and to me. And so I leave with you this marvelous story. God is the author. There is a script. That purpose is a response to the sacred. When evil seems so intrusive, the cross redefines the reality and shows God right in the middle of our need. The problem of suffering and evil is internal before it is external. Death to self sprouts life in uniqueness. And here's the last link. I want you to hear me very carefully. You see, if pain were the only problem that keeps me from meaning, the problem would become very complex, even more than we think it is. But meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness ultimately comes from being weary of pleasure. Chesterton said that. The loneliest people in the world are those who've exhausted pleasure and come away empty. I wrote a book on an imaginary conversation between Oscar Wilde and Jesus. I called it Sense and Sensuality. It's part of a series. The first one was Jesus Talks to Buddha, the Lotus and the Cross. Second one was Sense and Sensuality, Jesus Talks to Wilde. The third one was The Lamb and the Fury, Jesus Talks to Hitler. There were half a dozen others. Oscar Wilde, lying in bed in Paris. I visited that hotel, died in his 40s. He turns to his lover, Robbie Ross, and he says this, listen, Robbie, did you ever love any one of those young boys for their own sake? Wow. A hedonist on his deathbed wanting a definition of love. Did you ever love one of them for their own sake? He said, no, I didn't, Oscar. He said, neither did I. Bring me a priest. And in his poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, he said, only the blood of Christ now is able to cleanse the stain in this heart of mine. Interesting that a hedonist, for the verse to be put on his grave in Paris in a massive phoenix, the verse that he chose was the verse from the book of Job on suffering. He had exhausted pleasure and found no meaning. So the problem is not just pain. The problem is pleasure, which means sacredness is at the core, and worship is the ultimate glue that puts life back together. That's our mission. That's what we talk about. And I want you to know, if you sincerely search that, I think you'll find why it is that the worldview comes together with the mystery and ultimately the script that God gives to you and me. You've been a very patient audience, and I want to thank you very much for being here.
Joining Dr. Zacharias on stage for our time of question and answer are his colleagues, Dr. Vince Vitale and Dr. Nabil Qureshi. Dr. Vince Vitale is a faculty member at Oxford University, where he wrote his PhD thesis on evil and suffering. Before that, he taught at Princeton University, where he received his bachelor's degree. Dr. Vitale is a member of Ravi Zacharias' international ministries and is passionate about the intersection of faith and athletics.
Dr. Nabil Qureshi has lectured at universities all across America. He holds an MD from Eastern Virginia Medical School and a master's in religion from Duke University. Dr. Qureshi comes from a Muslim background and is especially interested in the early history of Islam as it relates to the foundations of Christianity.
And leading us in this time of question and answer will be Matt Dahm, a junior mechanical engineering student here at Hopkins.
Thank you, everyone, first off, for being so patient and willing to move around. Everyone in the overflow rooms scattered across campus, we really appreciate everybody's willingness to cooperate, as we have so many people, and praise God for that. We're going to get into a time of Q&A, and so right now I would like to ask the people who fall under the category of students and faculty, and if your name does not associate with student or faculty, hold on tight. But students and faculty, if you have any questions, there's a microphone here. We'd ask you to line up now. Did Dr. Zacharias actually answer all your questions? All right, fair warning.
Yeah, come on.
So, anyone? Okay, all right. This gentleman gets to go first. Take your time, sir.
Well,
okay, anybody else that would like to ask questions for Dr. Zacharias may line up now. For our friends up in the balcony, if you're feeling like it's hard to get down here, if you want to write your question on a $20 bill, fold it into a paper airplane and throw it down here, the chances of your question being asked are very high. One more announcement. As we ask questions, I would ask everyone to please limit their question to the number of 1, so we can get through as many people as possible. And as soon as you're ready, sir, we'll begin.
Well, I just want to say, I just want to say that I really appreciate everything Dr. Zacharias and, in fact, our ministry, but especially Dr. Zacharias, I very much appreciate and follow your ministry, so thank God for you in every way. And I guess my question is not so much inquisitive, but more for practical application to my own life. And being ministers and ambassadors of the gospel of Christ, and being apologists as well, and covering so many, like a broad spectrum of topics, where do you find the balance in really, I guess, centering everything around the cross? Because your lecture was very powerful, and I think it really hit to the core of a lot of subjects. But I don't know, sometimes I just feel like, the cross may be, and I know for the sake of time, you really rushed through it, but I guess, like, where do you find that balance in really emphasizing the power of the cross and still being able to target those various issues that poke at the heart, I guess?
It's a great question, and of course, my colleagues will probably be happy to answer that too. They're of more recent vintage. I'm the dinosaur in the team now. I've been around for a long time. Truth comes from so many disciplines, and truth will ultimately be unified if you have believed the truth as it can be measured in that discipline. And so we are readers, or we travel, we spend a lot of time in the air. When you go from here to Thailand or something, you feel like you're celebrating a couple of birthdays on your journey going over there. We just have to read, we have to study, we have to understand. And at the same time, we have families, we have commitments, we have values by which we must live. You're at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. You're researching. What a privilege it is for you students to be here and enjoy what probably millions of other students would love to have. Study, work hard, do your best in understanding your discipline to be the best that you can be in what it is. So you have to have balance in reading. You can't just read in one discipline. You have to reread in philosophy and history and science, in epistemology, truth issues and psychology and social theory, and of course biblical subjects, theology, New Testament studies, Old Testament studies, languages and all of that. It's very hard work, and if it's properly done, it has to be kept in balance. It's the same way with life itself. You cannot live at the extreme of work. You have to have the balance of respite and rest and quietness and all of that. So just distribute your reading and make notes as you read so that you can recall when you need to recall what it is that you actually read. It's important to keep that. So keep a balanced life. Simple. Yep.
Thank you very much. And I think for everybody's sake, you can just stand really close to the microphone so that we all get a chance to hear the question.
All right. Coming in good? Yes. All right. For Ravi, Vince, and I'm sorry, Nafil. Excuse me. Question being, if we are to accept, if one is to accept individual ethics, social ethics, and also what do we require? Epistemological ethics, the ethics of a general type. If we look at something which we would consider to be like a deontological imperative, when we're dealing with atrocities being committed by proxy, such as our tax monies going towards warfare, going towards espionage, and other things which are morally contemptible.
You are obviously
such
being
as that.
listened to. Yeah.
Isn't that saying something?
That's the NSA.
Did the mic die on me? I believe the mic died.
I hate to tell you this.
The microphone. I killed the mic.
I hate to tell you this. That was the NSA listening on to what you're going to say. Go ahead.
If I may continue. So if these things are truly present in our society, what is the obligation on an individual who has accepted universal ethics of that type? And where there is inaction, is it not a consequence thereof that the individual bears a certain responsibility? And where does that deontology more or less give the cause, for response?
Sure, I'll say something to that. I think it's a decision that everyone needs to make in terms of specifically where our consciences are telling us things that we're a part of that that are wrong. The example in my mind that comes back to me most recently was actually an atheist that challenged me on this sort of point in this sort of environment, where he stood up in the back and he said, after a talk, he said, I know I'm a sinner because I had a beer last week. And I looked at him like, that's an odd thing to say. And everyone laughed. And then he said, no, I'm serious. He said, I every week indiscriminately spend my money on things simply for my own luxury when there are people who are starving in the world. And I had never had someone put that to me so directly. And it just made me think about what are the things that I'm complicit in? What are the things that my money goes to? It was largely the way that the early church in the first 2 or 3 centuries used the money that God had entrusted to it, that it grew. It was largely because during the plagues of the 2nd century and the 3rd century, you were statistically more likely to survive if you knew a Christian. And that's one of the major reasons that the church grew initially. So I think your point is well taken, and I think it's precisely when the church is really being the church, really being what God has called it to be, by saying, how do we use what we have been entrusted with, and how do we take responsibility for what we're complicit in, that we actually love our neighbors in such a way that people will want to join that community. So continue to think about those things, but hopefully that's a starting point.
Thank you.
You wanted to say something, Nabil? No.
Hi, Robbie.
Yes.
Irene here from Nyack College. 2 years ago, I pleaded with God to give me his heart. Can you hear me?
Can you say again, please?
2 years ago, I pleaded with God to give me his heart. Since then, my husband and I have experienced a series of heartbreaks. Today, I had a CT scan performed at Hopkins because of a suspicious nodule on a chest x-ray. My breathing has worsened considerably. I am still suffering with presumptive MS of over 30 years. Why has our suffering escalated and in a state of perpetuity since praying this prayer?
Wow. There's no easy answer to that question, that's for sure. I remember speaking with my Aunt Regina once. This was a number of years ago, and she began to tell me some of the things that she was going through. And she spoke with me specifically about how difficult it was for her to see her son, Charles, my cousin, struggle with a severe mental illness. And at that time, I turned to her and I started to give some of my more abstract philosophical responses for why God might allow suffering of Charles's sort. And she listened to me really generously, really graciously, and then she turned to me and she said, Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother. And I thought it was a really fair response. I think Jesus realized this as well when his good friend Lazarus dies. He's late getting there. They had sent for him. He waits a couple days before he gets there. By the time he gets there, Lazarus has died, and Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, are not too impressed. Reading between the lines, it seems like they're saying, Jesus, what were you thinking? If you had been here on time, my brother would still be alive. What do you have to say for yourself? And with my convictions as a Christian, I believe that Jesus could have given an answer there. He could have defended himself, given an explanation. But we're not told that he did any of that. Instead, he just wept. He just wept with Mary and Martha at the death of their brother, his good friend. You know, the really interesting thing about what you said is you prayed that God would give you his heart. I think what actually has happened is he's taken on your heart. You've gone through a lot, and I don't have an easy answer for why you specifically have gone through those things. What I can tell you is that the night before Jesus died, as he struggled with what he knew the next day would bring. He said, "My heart is sorrowful even to death." The God of the universe, the creator of everything, saying that he's sorrowful even to death. Whatever each one of us has experienced, whether it's deep depression, whether it's thoughts about suicide, Jesus has been there. There's no depth of agony and helplessness that we can go through in this life that he doesn't understand. So I don't have any simple answers about why specifically, but sometimes it's really difficult for, as Ravi was saying, us to understand God's ways when we see such a small slice of the script or of the story. I'm thinking of the book of Job in the Old Testament. At the beginning of that book, there's a man named Job, and he loses everything. And it says he was an upright man. He was seeking after God's heart, and he loses everything. He loses family. He loses his wealth. He loses his animals. At the end of the book, it says that God gave back to him a double portion of everything that he had lost. He's given back twice as many animals. He's given back twice as much wealth. The interesting thing is he's only given back the same number of children. He loses 10 children at the end. He doesn't get 20 children at the beginning. He doesn't get 20 children at the end. He only gets 10 back. And I had never known why that was the case. I read a commentary recently, and they suggested maybe this is one way to read the passage. Maybe that's because Job didn't lose the 10 children at the beginning. Maybe he's just not with them for a time. And maybe just giving 10 back at the end of Job's life was to give him that double portion of 20 children. What if it's the case that what we see is literally just the first few moments of our lives? What if it's really the case that one day there's going to be a place where the Bible says God himself will wipe every tear from our eyes? There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. What if one day Job will be reunited with all of his children? What if one day so much of what appears lost in this life is actually only lost for a time? So I don't have a simple answer for you, but I do believe that I have a God who gives hope, and that will be my prayer for you.
Ma'am, I wanted to add to that. I never really thought about the 20 children from Job. That's very interesting. I think if he did get 20 children, that might have been more punishment than not. So
fair
that
point,
could be one
fair
answer. I haven't studied philosophy quite the way Vince has, and so that's why I was hoping he would go first. My experience has been more in the medical field and the sciences, and as a student of medicine, one of the things that absolutely blew my mind, one of the things that we took for granted quite regularly, was just how finely hinged life is on the precipice of death. It's just, we so take it for granted that we wake up every morning. What say do we have in waking up in the morning? We go to sleep and we wake up and it happens regularly, and so we take it for granted. But there's nothing we do to make that happen cognizantly. And we think about momentarily the malady that you mentioned, that you have, the multiple sclerosis. We just act. So immediately we act. We see things, we can point to it, and it's so natural to us. We don't even think about what's happening here, that your brain and your nerves function as electrical systems, and you have capacitors that allow a signal to go from your brain to your finger and for your muscles to work at the very fast rate at which they do. And those capacitors, if they stop working, these myelin sheaths, you get multiple sclerosis. Just one small part of a very complex system can cause such devastating effects. And as painful as it is, I think one thing that you have probably learned is just how beautiful it is and how much people take it for granted when this amazingly complex system works the way it ought to. Something we take for granted every single day. And I know when I pray, early on when I began to pray as a Christian, you know, I was a Muslim formerly, and part of my prayer was the 5 daily prayers. It was very scripted. Everything was scripted. The only thing I got to choose in my 5 daily prayers was which portion of the Quran to recite. So when I began to learn how to pray as a Christian, these improvisational prayers, I said, what am I supposed to pray? And I'd look at my hands as I'm praying. I'm saying, I got 10 things to pray about right here. every single thing. And what if I didn't have these? I mean, my whole life would be absolutely different. And so you have learned that message, unlike many of the rest of us will ever be able to learn it. But the other thing that I learned in the process of transitioning from Islam to Christianity, the other thing that I learned was that God, according to Islam, we don't learn this. God did not stand apart from your suffering. He didn't watch you suffer and say, I want to see what she ultimately does. I want to see what way she finds for herself. God takes a look at our suffering and says, I cannot remain aloof from that suffering. I will enter into it. You know, Jesus could have come as a prince in a human sense. He could have come with power. He could have come at any time in human history. He chose to come at a very specific time when people had invented how to execute people the most painful way ever devised. The most humiliating way ever devised. God said, that type of suffering, which goes beyond all other suffering, that's what I will choose to take on for myself. He entered into it. And why did he do that? Out of love for you. He didn't watch you suffer and stand aloof. He took that suffering upon himself so that he could show us what true love was all about. And you are learning this in a way none of the rest of us will. And so I praise the Lord for who he is, and I praise the Lord for who you are. You were designed before the creation of the world. This is also a Christian truth. You were designed before the creation of the world with every single aspect of you in mind. You are not incidental. You are not random. You are not an accident. You are a loved creation of God. And that is absolutely amazing. So if I can encourage you with anything, it's who he is and who he's made you to be.
Been through a lot of suffering getting here today. I've been through a lot of suffering just getting here today. And my question is regarding the grace of God. The Bible says the grace of God knows no end. My question is it possible for God to have a plan to redeem the condemned, those who have passed away and have not accepted him? Because the Bible says the grace of God goes so far. Is it possible to have a place where he just doesn't look anymore? Hell is an absence of God, right? But God is omnipresent. So does that kind of contradict itself?
Is it possible?
And is it possible for God to have a plan to redeem these people that hasn't just been revealed yet, knowing how deep his grace is?
There is nothing in the Bible that intimates the chance after death. There's a passage in Peter to which people sometimes refer, and one particular sect believes that. What I have found is that wherever I have gone, I am amazed at how God has been able to reach people in places that I never even thought his voice would have been heard or the gospel would ever have been preached. I don't know if you've ever read the story of Sammy Morris from Africa. It's called The March of Faith. How he came out of that tiny little village and somehow was a stowaway on a ship, arrived in New York, and went looking for somebody who could open up life for him. And when Samuel Merritt gave him the gospel, he said, that's the one I've been looking for. That's the name I never had, but that's the Savior I have always wanted. And in fact, Taylor University, where he went and attended, has the chapel named after Samuel Morris. I think you and I need to bear in mind that God, who is omniscient and omnipotent, has a way of reaching people way beyond what you and I may actually imagine. Let me give you my own personal illustration. I had never cracked open a Bible on my own in my life. And when I lay on a hospital bed there, the last thing I really expected was a Bible to be brought to me. And yet this individual comes in to my hospital room, gives me that Bible. I couldn't hold it because my body was totally dehydrated with the poison that I'd taken and all the moisture that I'd thrown out of my system. I couldn't hold it, so he gives it to my mother. My mother, reading in the King James language, didn't do very well, but she was reading through it in John chapter 14. And I had to ask myself, how did this happen? That I, as a total destitute, am lying in a hospital bed and this man comes in with a Bible to give me the scriptures to read. This man ended up, he's an Indian man, ended up living in California, and he passed away in February of this year. And I spoke to him a few weeks before he died. I phoned him, he was living in a lot of pain. And he said this to me on the phone. I quoted it at Princeton that night, and I didn't know his daughter was listening in on the phone. And she asked if she could put it as one of his eulogies on the website because he just passed away the week before. He said, Ravi, I sometimes wonder if I came into this world just in order to be able to come and bring this Bible to you in the situation in which you were. You know, I started crying on the phone, and I said to him, I said, you know, Fred, God had a lot more for you in life than just that. He found it totally fulfilling that whatever prompting he had in his heart to bring the scriptures to a desperate young man at 17 and give him the verse from John chapter 14 where Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. God has amazing ways of reaching people in places that you and I would never, ever dream about. Let me give you one more illustration of this, and I'll be seated, and after that. My brother-in-law, Sundar Krishnan, came from an Orthodox Brahmin Hindu family. We grew up together. I've always said I thought for a lot of time that he liked me, found out he liked my sister. He's my brother-in-law now. He was a nuclear physicist for the Atomic Energy of Canada, gave that up. In the peak of his career as a chief safety expert, went into Christian ministry. His father and mother, quite orthodox in their beliefs, and they would talk to them, I would talk to them, they would sit listening. And the father was a very, very sophisticated thinker and a very moral man. He never said much. He would read C.S. Lewis, he would take me into a side room and ask me some questions. Sometimes he didn't want to do it openly. At the age of 85, he died. It was on Thanksgiving weekend, Canadian Thanksgiving. And he was lying in bed there, and my sister told me, we walked into the hospital with my children and all of the relatives, and he's lying there in bed, and he said, I want to say something to all of you. You know the kind of life I've led. You know the manner of truth I have pursued. You know who I am. I've done my best never to cheat anybody, never to defraud anybody. But he said, I'm dying now, and I know my end is near. So I want to answer the question I have pursued all my life. What is the way to God? And my sister said, Rav, we were standing around the bed there, and I wondered what he was going to say. With our grandkids and all of his friends standing. He said, I have come to the conclusion, lying on my hospital bed here, all alone and seeking for answers, that the answer is in Jesus Christ. He said, that's my Savior, that's my Lord, and I leave him with all of you before I depart. Nobody talking to him in that hospital room. Nobody sharing anything with him. So you know what the Bible says, shall not the judge of all the earth do that which is right? You can be absolutely confident that God will do what is right, what is pure, what is loving, and what is just. Nabil said this, and I think it was Jürgen Moltmann who quoted Elie Wiesel. Standing in concentration camp, Elie Wiesel saw a young man struggling as he was being hanged, struggling for life. And he said, I kept asking, where are you, God? Where are you? And he said, out of nowhere, the voice came into my mind, and I can't figure out why. The voice came saying, hanging there on the gallows, where else? This Christ, who gave himself for you and for me, will go to the trouble of revealing himself to all the ends of the earth. And the Bible makes that very clear, even in the book of Romans. Worry about what you know and what you must share to the other part of the world. God will do that which is right as he's given us the opportunity. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. Hello.
Hi. Yes.
Okay. Hi. This is for Ravi. So, like in the very beginning of your argument, you said that humans have a very unpredicative understanding of reality, and as you said, we are not asking the question from the outside because we are actually within the question. So, like my question is, what makes you so sure that there exists an absolute reality for which there is a moral system to define? You know, what is to stop the existentialist from saying that there's a plural realities, and reality is actually subjective, which makes moral subjective as well, morality subjective as well.
Just repeat the last line. What is to keep the existentialist from?
You know, like, what's to stop the existentialist from saying there in fact exists a plural of realities, and because reality is subjective, morality is subjective as well?
Sure. Yeah, I don't see a point of tension there, but let me see if I can clarify that, and if any one of you men want to pitch in, it's this. I've always said I have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grid in which I come to the knowledge of God and reality. One is the claim that Jesus made, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes into the Father except through me. So when he made that claim, he's making a truth claim. He's making an exclusive claim. Now, that does not necessarily mean it's the truth, but that's what he's claiming. He's claiming to be the unique and exclusive truth. And one of the properties of truth is that it does exclude. Truth, by definition, makes an assertion that excludes the contrary position. Now, how do I know what he claimed is to be true? You have two tests for the truth. You have the correspondence theory and you have the coherence theory. Correspondence means particular claims, when tested against reality, correspond to reality as it actually is. So when the prophetic schema from the Old Testament, all the way from the 5 books of Moses down to the prophets and the laws and so on, you see the hundreds of prophecies that were made in there. Did they correspond to reality? If you go to the book of Daniel and go from 9 through 12, it's incredible the prophecies Daniel made in the late 500s before Christ. He talked about how there would be the 4 kingdoms and how 4 would be reduced to 2 and 2 ultimately to 1. And you see after Alexander the Great, the 4 generals that took over, and then you see the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires, and you see the emergence of the Roman Empire. And then it says a stone that no man could cut from nowhere would come and shatter this single empire as well, referring to Rome. Late 500s, when Babylon was in power, to see all the prophetic schema. So, corresponding to reality. One other test. If Jesus wanted to fake who he was, here's a very simple thing he would have said. This worked away in my mind as a brand new Christian because I know how we think coming from the East. Jesus could have said, I will demonstrate to you who I am, so that after you have crucified me, in 3 days I will rise from the dead. You know, he could have made it a very safe prophecy by saying, I will spiritually rise from the dead. How do you falsify that? If he were just going to spiritually rise, there's nothing you could bring, not even the body, to falsify it, because the protagonist would have said, yeah, he never said he'd bodily rise again. He just said he'd spiritually rise again. So in presenting his body, you've not proved him wrong at all. That's the kind of claim he would have made. But instead he said he would physically rise from the dead, bodily rise from the dead. Even after that, that's what prompted Thomas, who went to India with its 330 million deities, and came to India to proclaim Jesus and paid with his own life. He said, unless I see, feel, and touch, I'm not going to believe. And when the risen Christ came to him, and he reached out and touched his hand and bowed and worshipped, the Greek words say, ho kuriosmu, ho theosmu, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, you know, you've seen and believed, blessed are those not having seen, believe. Correspondence theory. And then coherence. The questions that we ask and the confluence of answers given have to cohere. So it's not just a case of multiple choices. The correspondence theory and the coherent theories have to come together. So if you talk about the existentialist, of course, there's a wide array of them, all the way from Nietzsche to Sartre to Heidegger to Camus and so on, wide variety of existentialist thought. But they themselves, Sartre on his deathbed says, I find my existential view of the way I've defined it incoherent and unlivable. I've footnoted that in my book, The Real Face of Atheism. So you've got one question, two tests, correspondence, coherence. How do you narrow the tests? Logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. 1, 2, 3. 4 questions. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. 5 subjects. God, reality, knowledge, ethics, anthropology. You bring these 5 subjects to be studied, the 4 questions to be answered, the 3 tests for truth, the 2 categories, and the 1 question, and you will find that there cannot be a multiplicity of answers, but the only one who really meets the test from 1 to 5 is the one who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. So it's not just a whim. It's very well put together in the answers that Jesus has put for you and me. Thank you.
I'll just follow up on that briefly by just sharing a bit of my own story, because this was one of the big things for me. I showed up as a freshman in college at Princeton, and I wasn't a Christian, and I didn't think there could be objective evidence for something like faith. There was just this assumption on my part that faith was blind. Someone challenged me to read the Bible for the first time. I accepted that challenge, and as I started to read through it, I would cross things out and I would add things, and I'd actually write BS in the margins when I disagreed with things. And people would sort of look over my shoulder and say, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And I'd say, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. I had that Bible for a while, and kind of months later I needed to go back and start crossing them out and say, sorry, God, my bad. But just to say that one of the things which was so encouraging to me as I started to read through the New Testament, if you get through the Gospels, then you get into the book of Acts where it's talking about the early church, and you just over and over come across words like reasoned and convinced and debated and argued and persuaded, which is actually the word that's most used for when someone comes to be a Christian. They were persuaded to the way. And this just sort of blew my mind in terms of the way of understanding faith. And that started a kind of intellectual search, which ultimately led to me making a commitment of faith. I had thought that I was too smart for Christianity, that it was my mind that kept me from faith. What I was forced to see ultimately was that it wasn't my mind. It wasn't that the evidence didn't add up. It actually had a lot more to do with my heart. There's a colleague of mine, an Oxford professor. He's probably the most significant British philosopher of religion of the last half century or so. And in 2003, he wrote a book called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that on the available evidence today, it's 97% probable that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the God that he claimed to be, and that he rose from the dead. Now, he says in the book, you can't take the numbers too seriously. He likes to work with probability theory, so he gives an estimate in actual calculations and numbers. But still, the fact that someone of his intellectual caliber and reputation can make that claim, make it in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and then ably defend it at academic conferences all around the world, I think one of the things it shows is that there is a strong intellectual case for the Christian faith. If you're in this room tonight and you just assume that that hasn't been the case, that's where I was. And I just want to encourage you, seek that out. That's not the case. And when you see that that's not the case, then maybe, like me, that will cause you to ask the question, is it really my mind that keeps me from Christian faith? Is it really a lack of objective evidence, or does it have more to do with my heart? What I concluded was, in my case, it had a lot more to do with my heart. It wasn't that the evidence didn't add up. It was that I liked being my own God. You know, Nietzsche put it really well when he said, if there is a God, how can I bear not being him? Okay? That really resonated with where I was. Hopefully that'll be helpful to someone.
I see the MC is getting up, and I see that they're trying to close it, so this is the perfect time for me to interject. I want to follow up with what Vince just said. He made a great point that really applied to my life as well. He's saying that we can look into this intellectually with rigor and test and see that the claims are strong. I want to point out to you that I did not come to Christianity willingly. Far from it. I was raised in an Islamic family. My family was devout. I loved Islam. I loved praying 5 times a day. I loved waking up for fasting during the month of Ramadan. I loved hearing the adhan. I loved giving the adhan. My heart was with the faith of my fathers. And I knew that if I were to accept Christ, I mean, there was very little worse that I could do with my life as far as my families were concerned than me accepting Christ. As a family that had built its reputation, its honor on the fact that we had followed Islam from generations past. My grandfather was a Muslim missionary. My great-grandfather was a Muslim missionary. The two of them spent their lives in Uganda and in Indonesia spreading Islam. Our reputation, our honor in this honor-shame culture came from the fact that we were devout adherents of Islam. And so for me, if I were going to accept Christianity, I was going to have to give up my parents who loved me from childhood. I was going to have to give up my friends in my community that I had been accepted in, and in fact that I was a Muslim leader of. I was leading the youth. I was teaching them the Aqidah. I was teaching them the way to live the Islamic life. I would have to give all this up, and I didn't know any Christian friends who were going to accept me into their arms. I had one Christian friend, and he was about to move. I was going to be alone. And I was going to do the most damage that anyone ever did to my parents. I was going to have to live with that. And I knew as the decision was coming, and I knew I had to choose between God and my entire life. Do I take my family, do I take my friends, or do I pick God? And when I could no longer run away from the fact that I had to pick my Creator, I bowed the knee and accepted Him. And what came next was the most painful year of my life. My parents... my father was a 24-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, retired lieutenant commander. I never saw him shed a tear until the day he found out I was a Christian. He said to me, Nabil, this day I feel as if my backbone has been ripped out from inside me. And I tell you, he has never stood as tall since that day. And my mother, I've not quite gotten over the fact that she's never been filled with joy as she had been. And every single day as I had to call my parents and I had to see them and I had to see what I had done with them, I was asking God, why did you leave me here? Why couldn't you have killed me between the moment I became a Christian and between the moment I told my parents? Because that would have solved everything. That would have been great. Everyone would be happy right now. Why am I still here? What is this suffering about? And it was in that moment of anguish when I'm trying to figure out what this life was about that I realized the reason God didn't kill me, the reason God didn't take me away was because this life is not about me. There are people around the world today, not the least in the medical school where I was attending, where they had no idea how life was meant to be lived. Every single day they sleep, they don't know why they're working, they're jaded, they're upset, they're disillusioned with the world around them. They came to learn how to help people, that's why they were learning medicine, and yet what they saw every single day in the ER was an abuse of the medical system, or someone who shot their wife, or someone who beat up on their children, and they're seeing these things and they're jaded and they don't know why they're there anymore because they don't care about people anymore. And you see other people coming into the hospital who are trying to figure out what they're doing with life. All they know to do is to work a job so they can have enough money to pay the bills, to work the job and keep going. And they have no understanding of what life is about. And I have now encountered the living God. I have drank from that draught of a well that gives peace and joy and purpose and hope. You know, when you know that you've been created for a reason, when you know that that thing you do, that passion you have, was crafted by God, then you realize that you are made with a purpose, that you were made to change this world. Every single one of you out there, I don't care how meaningless you think this life is being lived by you. I don't care if you think you have no purpose. You can change the world. Because God has created you in a specific way, knowing you and loving you and equipping you. And this truth, if we all heard it, if we all shared it, if those of us who at least believed it, and I'm not talking to all Christians here, and I know that, but if there are those of us who are here who knew that what they believed was real and that they ought to live it out with their life, then this world would not be the same. That is what I realized. To sum it up, to follow up on what Vince was saying, if you have to give up a lot, and I know there are people in this room right now who have to give up a lot if they want to follow Christ. If you have to give up everything, I'm swearing to you, having walked down that path, it is absolutely worth it.
To the end of our time. This isn't working, is it? No. That's the end of our time for right now, but Dr. Zacharias would like to make a closing remark for everybody before they leave.
Let me just say, first of all, I want to thank you for being here. I know there are people of different worldviews. I know those of them who've watched the live stream, you may come from a different perspective. I want you to know we have to learn to live and to let live. With all of our differences, the most beautiful thing that happens in an occasion like this is that this worldview is given a chance to defend itself. And I think in an institution of this caliber, where you have the openness to hear different worldviews, hear defenses, then you have the intelligence to study and to come to terms with what is truth and what is not true. So I just know that as we travel many places, India is the land of my birth, and I'm 80% Hindu, and yet I've spoken at many of the universities. Some of the largest audiences I've spoken to are in the Islamic world. In Kuala Lumpur, the oldest Islamic university, where they had me come and present a defense of the Christian faith, we do it. We try to present to you the answers that Jesus Christ has given to the deepest questions of life. Even if you disagree, we want to honor your right to disbelieve and to honor your right in what you choose to believe. The most important thing is that you believe what you do because it's the truth and because it is truly the truth that can be proclaimed across this globe. And we've presented the person of Christ here. In many of our writings we've done that. I want to close with this quotation and then with a simple illustration. And by the way, one of the great graduates from here who taught for many, many years was a PhD, and I think I have his quotation right here. I'd like to get that for you because I think it'll be important to see if we can get that. Yeah. Hobart Maurer got his PhD from Johns Hopkins. He committed suicide at the age of 75 in 1982. And here's what he said. He was a skeptic. Had the honors of getting his PhD from here, then taught at Yale, taught at Harvard. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to have the experience of being sick rather than being sinful, is to also court the danger of becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing, in becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free. We have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? And then he quotes the Anna Russell folk song. At 3 I had a feeling of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it followed naturally. I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. Evil can be talked about for hours. My question to you is this: have you seen the evil in your own heart? Forget the externality of evil. Have you seen the evil in your own heart? James Stewart of Scotland said, "It is a glorious phrase that he led captivity captive. The very triumphs of his foes it means he used for their defeat. He compelled their dark achievements to subserve his ends, not theirs. They nailed him to the tree, not knowing by that very act they were bringing the world to his feet. They gave him a cross, not guessing that he would make it a throne. They flung him outside the gates to die, not knowing in that very moment they were lifting up all the gates of the universe to let the King of glory come in. They taught to root out his doctrines, not understanding that they were implanting imperishably in the hearts of men the very name they intended to destroy. They thought they had God with his back to the wall, pinned and helpless and defeated. They did not know it was God himself who had tracked them down to that point." Here's the closing statement he makes. Jesus did not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquered through it. He did not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquered through it. I've lived with 2 metal rods in my back from L3 to S1 and 8 screws bolting me down after an injury. For 27 years, I lived with unbearable pain. And something incredible happened last year. I won't go into that. But when you wake up in the morning and not know if you're going to be able to even bend down to tie a shoelace, when you can't pick up your bag that's more than 3 pounds. I travel with an assistant because of my broken back. Pain is a horrible thing in life, but I have learned through that pain how precious God is in his presence and helps you to conquer through it. I just want you to know that pain is not easy for us when we bear it. I lost both of my parents in my 20s. And you never look at the world the same way. But as Muggeridge said, I believe with all of it that some of the greatest experiences in life have come not through pleasure, but through what I have learned in pain. And maybe that's what the cross of Jesus Christ signifies. In the 1960s, I heard a song by the Kingston Trio. It's a desert traveler going through with all the bottles of water, and he's getting thirsty as the water finishes. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He sees a pump in the middle of the desert. He doesn't know if it's a mirage. He lunges towards it and feels it's real. But when he lifts the handle and brings it down, metal upon metal, there's no water. Till he sees a tin can around the nozzle, and in the tin can is a message that says this: "Traveler, don't despair, there's plenty of water here, just follow the directions." Directly under the faucet, in the sand, under that, you'll have a bottle of water. It should be full. Don't drink it. Don't drink it. Uncork it, pour it into the cylinder, and prime it with the other hand. The suction system will begin to work. Water will come gushing out. You can drink all the water you want, refill all the bottles you've got. Don't forget to fill up that one bottle and put it back for the next person passing by. Warning, you're going to be tempted to disbelieve this note and consume that one bottle because it's in your hand. Don't. You will soon be thirsty again, and so will everyone else who passes by. Empty out as instructed, and you'll have all the water you want. Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. Life's like that. You can choose to consume it on yourself, and you'll soon be empty. Empty it out in the hands who gave himself for you and gives you the answers, both in proposition and in presence. And in his presence, you find that peace that passes all understanding and the hope that lies beyond the grave. He wept, knowing pain is real, but he raised him from the dead, knowing that he is the author of life as well. May you find that author. I want to thank Johns Hopkins for making it possible for us to be here, and all of the organizing committee. What a tribute to the great halls of learning. I hope you can have more forums like this. Thank you for giving us a warm welcome. God bless you. Thanks, guys. Bless you.